Well, Lisa, good morning, and once again, Happy New Year to you. Look, I think Museveni's legacy, unfortunately, leaves so much in doubt. Let's not forget that he is a gentleman who came to power through military means and sort of promised the Ugandans a democratic rule, which in the end, typical of such transactions, politically speaking, the democratic rule was never delivered to the Ugandans. He's been in power for so many years, and I don't think he is in a position to relent that power to any sort of a democratic dispensation. Again, part of your question would then ask us, what kind of role did he play, past and present by and large, in influencing, in particular, the politics of the Great Lakes, if you want to call it that way, or Equatorial Africa? He had a lot to play. Let's not forget that. The domestic politics of the Democratic Republic of Congo, together with the late Robert Mugabe, were once allies in terms of influencing the politics there and joined forces, which unfortunately did not necessarily give us the long-term political stability that Africa and that part of the continent so yearned for. So, in a sense, he's been a controversial figure on a number of cases, especially trying to influence the politics of that region. Lately, I think he is aware that he is getting old, I must admit, and he's been seen on press platforms, both electronic and print, trying to demonstrate his somewhat fitness to hold office, which I suspect is all part of expressing that sense of worriness that perhaps his time has come.
Now, Professor, speaking of those, appeals that he has been undergoing ahead of these elections, just also looking at the treatment of opposition at large, I particularly want to focus on the current electioneering atmosphere. I mean, there are reports coming through of oppression and repression of the opposition, as well as the media. We're also looking at the treatment of some of the opposition parties to date as well. I mean, what does that reflect of the culture, of its governance, and also the potentiality of the success of the elections when it does happen at the end of in Jan?
Look, Lisa, it's quite worrying when one looks at the current levels of violence in Uganda, especially the kind of violence that is meted out to people like Bobi Wine and perhaps other opposition parties. But most prominently, Mr. Bobi Wine has been at the receiving end of state-sponsored violence. Wherever he goes campaigning, unfortunately, he is accompanied by your police who at any given time would either stop a rally from continuing or basically disrupt whatever Bobi Wine and the youth politicians, because rightly so, Bobi Wine attracts a lot of youth followers. And I think this is what Museveni is trying to tell us, that he is worried that in a country where the youth population is somewhat considerable in terms of numbers, may very well upset his own leadership in that part of the country. And therefore, this kind of state-sponsored violence, as meted out by the police, would suggest to us that Museveni's government is quite worried that Bobi Wine's movement in particular might actually upset the continuation of the Museveni regime. It's just unfortunate that so far campaigning has been marked by public violence, in some instances, fatalities, and of course, the control of the mass media as a way of making sure that Museveni's tenure is not interrupted at all cost.
Yeah, on that note, Professor, I mean, we then also have to look at the youth culture that is emerging in Uganda. That wave also extended into the African continent. I mean, we do know that Africa has the largest concentration of youth to date. How are these dynamics going to influence the electoral process come the elections in January?
Well, listen, my understanding is one needs to trace it back to the so-called Arab Spring. In most Arab nations where there was regime change all the way down to Sudan, we speak of youth coming to the fore, taking their rightful positions in the body politic. If one might put it in that sense. And the use of technology these days has come to the aid of facilitating youth politics, which, as you put partially in your question, has dominated political scenes, not only in Africa, but globally by and large. I mean, one can extend this as far as your campaigns around the Black Lives Matter movement and all other related matters. But in this instance, I have no doubt that the continent has embraced youth politics. In South Africa, we speak of the EFF, for example, which somewhat has managed to influence, especially in the SADC region, the franchising, if one might call it that way, of youth politics. We've seen the emergence of the so-called EFF in Namibia, EFF in Zimbabwe, and other frontline states. So it comes as no surprise that people like Bobi Wine have taken the mettle and the responsibility to say they want to lead this struggle, if you want to call it that way, and taking cue from places once again such as South Africa with your hashtag fees must fall. All of these movements speak to one particular political narrative that youth politics once again post 1976 in South Africa is beginning to shape the politics of the continent.
Now, Professor, just monitoring these scenarios that are unfolding ahead of the elections in January, reports, as I alluded to, coming through about the oppression and, and repression of journalists and the opposition. I mean, what are the expectations? What is the international community also focusing in on as we await the elections and the results, perhaps possible hints of violence as well?
Well, it will be interesting, firstly, to look at the African Union. What is their response in this instance? And I would cast my attention to them, given the fact that they have a say when it comes to issues of the continent, how politics, how issues of peace and security by and large should be maintained and promoted. But also, let's not forget the fact that your so-called Great Lakes region have been influenced by, unfortunately, individual state politicking, if you want to call it that way. The influence of Rwanda in this instance comes to the fore. I mean, people like Paul Kagame would like to have a say, not necessarily through military intervention or support of some sort, but through open dialogue to say, hold on, we've had these discussions before. With the Mo Ibrahim funded sessions, a talk and a clarion call was made. Surely Africa cannot afford right now to have the so-called your breakfast boys. By that, I mean older men who have been in control and still have ambitions, politically speaking, to govern their own countries. It is time for change. It is time to promote democratic practices in most African states. And of course, give room for youth to start being involved in politics as early as now, so that the future that belongs to them is somewhat secured. So these, I think, are the dynamics that are likely to play themselves out in the coming few months in relation to the issue of Uganda. It will be interesting, however, to see a coalition of African leaders persuading, if not putting pressure on Museveni to call it a day. How will that happen remains to be seen.
All right, Professor Barry Hanyane.